Israeli arms factories are being shut down across the UK, and when protesters are arrested and put on trial in front of a jury of their peers, they've largely been acquitted of all charges. In this video, I'm talking to one of the activists at the centre of this direct action campaign, Huda Ammori. Huda, welcome to Declassified. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Huda, you've just been on trial for 6 weeks. To start with, could you tell me a little bit about how you first got involved with this issue?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm Palestinian on my father's side and Iraqi on my mother's side. And my father, when he was a young child, alongside his brothers and sisters, was forced out of his home in Palestine by the Israeli military. They were, in fact, shooting inside their home and they had to hide underneath the table in their front room and basically crawl out of their own house with just the clothes that they had on at the time and essentially run for their lives and eventually became refugees in Iraq. And my great grandfather in 1936 was shot and killed by a British soldier, assassinated essentially by the British for resisting the British colonial rule of Palestine before the Nakba happened in 1948. So I'd grown up aware of the situation in Palestine, aware of my own heritage and background, and why we weren't living in Palestine at that time. I grew up mostly in the north. I became aware of Elbit Systems, I think in 2016. So we were involved in a local campaign against the Oldham factory of Elbit Systems, which involved petitions, lobbying councillors, that kind of thing, regular protests.
This company that you decided to target, Elbit Systems, I remember a month before the current round of fighting in Gaza started, going to the arms fair in London, and Elbit and other Israeli arms companies all had huge stands with lots of kind of extra security around them. Whenever we went close, you could see kind of plainclothes security guys paying a lot of attention to me and my colleagues. And they have on display these enormous rockets. If someone stands in front of the rocket several times taller than the person, these huge munitions, which we know are what they're firing now on Gaza, and of course the drones as well that they make. Those are on display on the stands as well. So, can you tell us a little bit about how connected Elbit is to the Israeli military, and how much of their kind of manufacturing process is done here in the UK?
Elbit is Israel's largest weapons manufacturer, and so they provide the majority of the weaponry that we see being used by the Israeli military at this current moment in time in the current genocide, but also previously. We know now, for example, that they're using these Iron Sting missiles made by Elbit Systems, which are very, very new. And Palestinian doctors have reported that it's leaving burns on the killed Palestinians and the injured that they haven't seen before, that are unlike the ones that you see from white phosphorus or other types of munitions. And essentially, Elbit uses attacks on Gaza as a way of developing their weaponry. And they will go on to market them as battle tested. Another example of this is in 2021, in May 2021, during a bombing of Gaza, which lasted around 11 days, they were using artificial intelligence drone swarms for the first time. So rather than just one drone being operated by one person, which is far away in a room behind a computer screen, it was a swarm of drones, mostly running on artificial intelligence, only being operated by one person. And they called this the first AI war. And this is something that they're now trying to market on a global scale, again, as battle-tested weaponry. And we know that UAV engines, one of the factories in Shenstone, produce the engines used in these drones.
People who've been following what's happening in Gaza will have noticed on so many of the video clips that we see, there's this constant buzzing sound in the sky, which I understand is the drones. And the point you made about the AI, actually at the Arms Fair in London, so this was September 2023, one of the keynote speakers invited to this event, which bearing in mind is sponsored by the UK government. One of the keynote speakers was a general from the IDF who specialised in their research and development, and he was speaking about their use of AI for targeting. One thing that came out at your trial, when these actions eventually went to court, was that some of the prosecution witnesses weren't able to attend because they were themselves involved in operations in Gaza. Is that right? Could you tell us a bit more about that incident?
Yeah, so one of the witnesses for the prosecution who'd submitted a statement for this case, for the case that the state had against us, was Offer Maisha, who was listed as the head of Elbit's global security and is based in Israel. And we, as the defense, we have a right to call any witness who gives a statement to the prosecution to attend in person to be able to cross-examine them and put our questions to him, basically. And so we insisted that Offer Maisha comes to the court, either in person or through a video link, so that we could put our questions to him. And it was very difficult to get a clear understanding of why he couldn't come to the case until a letter came from the Israeli government, basically to the court, saying that Offer Maisha couldn't come to the court case. He wasn't allowed by the Israeli government to leave Israel at this time because of what was happening, which was the current genocide in Gaza, and that he was basically crucial to the Israeli government.
When you've done these protests at the Elbit factories, you've often received a lot of support from the local community, particularly I think in their factory near Leicester. So it's not just the activists who go into the factory and try and shut it down, but there's often a larger number of protesters outside the factory as well, showing their support. But how do you think the jury felt when they heard about some of your testimony? I saw in the article that you wrote for us this week that one of your co-defendants said he'd been on a protest in Palestine and he showed a rubber bullet made by Elbit that he had picked up that had narrowly missed him, but he said another bullet had hit a 15-year-old behind him and left them in a coma. How did the jury, what was your sense of how the jury felt when they were hearing this testimony?
You could tell that they were moved. I think there were a few tears at different points. One of the things that that really empowers you when you're going through the trial process is the opportunity to actually to show the court the extent of Elbit's crimes and what they're continuing to do to the Palestinian people on a daily basis. When I was on the stand, one of the things I talked about was that during the duration of me being on the stand, which was, I think, about 3 or 4 hours in total, how many Palestinians were killed while I was on there with no access, I would still know that, a Palestinian was being killed every 10 minutes. How many were still under the rubble because of Elbit's weaponry. And that is why we were taking these actions.
All this has been going on whilst the UK Conservative government have been trying to drive through a law that would criminalise boycott, divestment and sanctions activities, which seems to be very much in response to the impact that your campaign has been having. And it's interesting that you mentioned there, the reaction to the jury. There is, of course, a long history, as much as the government would try and like to paint you as kind of subversives. There is a long history in this country of ordinary people taking direct action against the arms industry. There was the Raytheon 9 case. There's also been Catholic workers who did actions against US Air Force bases in the UK that were linked to bombings in the Middle East. And there were some Quaker activists who broke into a BAE Systems factory in Wharton, that was supplying weapons for Saudi Arabia to bomb Yemen. And actually, in their case, I think it didn't go to a crown court. I think it went to a magistrate who felt it wasn't in the public interest to prosecute them. So, I mean, there's obviously a huge amount of risks, and it must be incredibly nerve-wracking when you go about these actions. But it's interesting to see actually how often, when they do eventually go to court, that even judges and the jury will actually find on the side of the activists who've taken these enormous risks. I know you said you've got a few more cases potentially coming up this year. How do you think that dynamic could shift if we see at the International Court of Justice a ruling in favour of South Africa's petition that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza? Do you think that could actually, completely shift the balance of international legal opinion in your favour? Is that something that you would then use as part of your defence, possibly?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it would have huge ramifications on lots of different levels. But I think in terms of our court cases, it will prove that, when we were taking these actions and when we say we did it to prevent the much greater crime, that we were that we were correct in doing so, and it's validation um, from the International Court of Justice that what Israel is doing is genocide, and all of those who are complicit in it and arming that genocide are also part and parcel of those crimes against the Palestinian people. One of the, as you said, when most ordinary normal people hear about these crimes that are happening and why people are taking direct action, they will side with the people taking action rather than siding with the interests of the powerful multinational arms dealers.